Hello there, and a very warm welcome to the latest in our series of webcast interviews ahead of the various party conferences. On this case, it's the Labour Party conference in Glasgow. It's going to be across the road in the Science Centre, so we've just come to the Pacific Quay headquarters of the BBC to conduct this one. I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Murphy, the Secretary of State for Scotland. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
No problem.
As ever, Mr Murphy, it's questions put in by our listeners, viewers, readers, however you define them. Thanks again for all the questions. Given that it's budget week this week, we'll go first with a question from Peter Johnston in Livingston. It's on the issue of public spending. He says that the Labour government at Westminster, as he puts it, has refused to accelerate $350 million of capital spending to the Scottish Government. What about that point?
Well, the Scottish Government's got more money today, Friday, than they had at the start of the week, £82 million more. So there's a big improvement there, and it's right that that money gets passed to the Scottish Government. We continue to look at further ways to get through the recession and ensure that the recovery is sustained. But, you know, I hear these arguments all the time from the SNP Edinburgh Government, and I just wish we know the point. They make the point repeatedly. There's a limited validity in it in terms of the complaints. And I just wish, rather than continually carping, they try and work with us to get through this recession and build secure recovery in Scotland. And an example would be in the budget. This Green Investment Bank, £2 billion. Now, I think if Scotland works together, we have the ingenuity, we have the brilliance, we have the talent, we have the determination and the chance to get more than half of that. There's £1 billion right away. It would dwarf anything to do with the capital reprofiling.
Still on that point about the investment bank, you were claiming that would be 150,000 jobs. Mr Salmond, Alex Salmond, said that was total fantasy.
Well, I'll leave the fantasy to him. I'll work on the hard reality.
We think it could be 150,000 jobs?
There's 100,000 green jobs straight away in terms of the investment that could make that happen. And then there's other things like the Future Jobs Fund, that's 10,000 more jobs. If you bring forward PFI, PPP again, there's another 10,000 jobs. So, look, creating jobs in this economy is our biggest priority, and 150,000 is our target.
Still on capital investment, it wasn't just Alex Salmond who wanted the acceleration of capital investment. It happened for 1 year. Ian Gray, your colleague in the Scottish Parliament, said, continue it, do it for a second year. The Treasury said a flat no, and that means, says Alex Salmond, the withdrawal of that there's a real terms cut of 1.3% in the Scottish budget this year.
Look, regardless of what you do to the Scottish budget, Alex Salmond claims it's a cut.
No, but he's published figures that are published by civil servants, not by SNP politicians.
The Scottish budget is double what it was when Donald Dewar was the First Minister.
Yes, but there's a real terms cut this year.
It's went up every year. No, there isn't a cut this year. There's £800 million more this year, and they got £82 million more again in the budget. And, you know, Scotland is more than the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government in Edinburgh isn't the living embodiment of Scotland. It's a crucial part and a vital part of our national life. But there's so much more to Scotland than a group of politicians in Edinburgh, which is why the measures on things like tax credits for mums and dads across Scotland, support for pensioners, more support for the unemployed, the Green Investment Bank, and support for first-time home buyers in Scotland, so those young folk in particular can get onto the property ladder for the first time. Those are enormous measures in Scotland. So rather than continually carping about what a bunch of politicians argue between one another, there's bigger issues and big issues across Scotland about how we support real people out of the recession and improve their lives.
OK, let's turn to that wider agenda of the budget then. Yesterday the Chancellor agreed that going forward, the figures in the Red Book, that's the Treasury's analysis of the way spending is shaping up. He said that going forward, he was asked, do these suggest deeper, tougher cuts than Margaret Thatcher's? He said, the Chancellor, your Cabinet colleague, said they will be deeper and tougher.
I think in the areas where it's less of a priority for the Labour Government, then yes, that's the case, and we'll set that out as we do in the comprehensive spending review.
What are those areas?
But on the areas that
what are the areas where it's less of a priority?
Well, we'll make that clear in the CSR, but what we've said very clearly is that we'll protect the NHS budget, we'll protect the schools budget, and we'll protect the funding for police numbers. Other than that, we'll look to where we can make savings. There will have to be a tightening of the belt. The public expect it. Families across Scotland are making savings this year because of the recession. Small businesses in particular across Scotland are tightening their belt, and I think that politicians should do the same. The public pay their taxes, they want it to work best for them, and there's an awful lot of waste still in the system, and we are going to have to make savings, and pretty deep savings, because we've saved these Scottish banks. We've had a big increase in unemployment, a reduction in the tax paid by those folk who have lost their jobs, and as a consequence we're going to have to make some pretty deep savings in the areas which in the CSR we'll spell out are less of a priority for Labour government.
But isn't it deeply dishonest to go into a UK general election having offered a few goodies and then say there's going to be hell to come in terms of deep cuts in public spending, but we're not going to tell you about those just now.
And we've been pretty clear that there are going to have to be savings as we come out of this recession and once it's stabilised. But there's no logic to have a 3-year spending review just a couple of weeks after officially being out of a recession. And while the economists and others celebrate the fact the recession is officially over, we all know that it's still very real for too many people in Scotland. People who have just lost their jobs and people who are in shorter working time and small businesses who are finding it difficult to get support from some of these banks. So the recession is still real for far too many people. Yeah. And there's no economic logic to us, just as we've come out of recession, to set out spending plans for a 3-year period. Because, quite frankly, it's very difficult to predict where we'll be next year, the year after, and the year after that, after the period we've just come through.
But Secretary of State, there's a mismatch here, because you have the Chancellor talking about deeper and tougher cuts, deeper and tougher than under Margaret Thatcher. You have yourself there saying there'll be substantial cuts. And then you're coming to a UK general election where you won't give us the details of those. And we have a figure, we have the document here, which is the second stage of your preparation for the manifesto in 2011 for the Holyrood Parliament. And it's absolutely full of potential spending promises. I mean, I've got to open here at the transport page, reinstate the Glasgow Airport rail link, build a high-speed rail connection from London to Glasgow and Edinburgh, and extend concessionary travel. And that's just one page. There's nothing in here about deeper and tougher cuts than Margaret Thatcher imposed.
Well, it's important, as I say, what we're committed to is the areas where we think is of less of a national interest, less national importance,
such as
a lower priority, and we'll spell that out in the CSR.
Such as, give us an example. If you're
able to prioritise
health and education, you must be able to prioritise.
One example would be, I think we can do an awful lot more, for example, to support those people who are on incapacity benefit, to get some of the jobs that we're talking about. Now, on average in Scotland, I think someone on incapacity benefit is on average on that benefit for about 8 years. That's a benefit cost of about £60,000. Now, I think those folk want to work. Most of those people want to work. And it's a grotesque abandonment of those folk that they're stuck on benefit for that long. So let's do more to support them. It would be smart investment, get them off of that benefit, into work, paying taxes. It's good for them and their family. And that would be an enormous saving. And we have 250,000 people in Scotland on that benefit. And that's just far too many. Now, I'm not saying there's a big stick to make that happen, but it would be sensible to support those folk who want to work to get the chance to work. And that would be an enormous saving, particularly in the west of Scotland.
Here's another enormous saving suggested by Joan Humphreys from Dundee. Thanks for your question, Joan. She says, would the money wasted on the war in Afghanistan and Trident not be better spent on improving public services? How about Trident in particular?
Well, Trident, I think it's important that we do reduce the number of warheads across the world. I don't think anyone would have, starting all over again, no one would have invented nuclear warheads and nuclear weapons. But in the world in which we now live in, where other nations have them, I think it would be foolish to unilaterally just get rid of ours at a time when Iran, for definite, North Korea, we think, is trying to acquire these weapons. I don't think it would be sensible to get rid of our nuclear weapons and have a world where we allow dictatorships such as those to acquire these dangerous weapons. I want to do, as President Obama has said, drastically reduce the number of warheads. The Labour government's gone further than most countries already to get rid of the number of nuclear warheads, and they'd like us to go further.
But isn't there an argument for permanently ratcheting up the nuclear competition?
I don't think so. I think there's an argument for finding ways to permanently ratchet down. I think we have to get into very serious multilateral talks with all of the countries involved to ensure that we together reduce our nuclear warheads. But the real problem here is countries like Iran and North Korea, because civilised nations and sensible countries can look to cut these warheads. But I don't want families in Scotland to grow up in a world where we get rid of our nuclear deterrent and allow people like North Korea and Iran to develop theirs.
OK, perhaps a final question on spending comes from Nick Lyon in Inverness. I mentioned the high-speed rail link. Nick Lyon wants to know why it can't start in Scotland instead of starting in London and only initially going to Birmingham.
Well, this is possibly the biggest infrastructural project for the next decades. It will cost billions of pounds of public and private money. And what we're doing, we're starting, as you rightly said, starting from the two largest population centres, London to Birmingham, and then trying to get it to Manchester and Leeds, and then supporting the business case to bring it to Scotland, including Glasgow, and Edinburgh.
That's not a guarantee that it's trying to get it to
no, we're committed. The Labour Party is very...
It's making the business case. It's not saying it will go to
Glasgow.
The
Labour Party is very committed to this, so we want to make the business case. We want to work with business, the private sector. We want to make sure that we can get this line to both Glasgow and Edinburgh, and if these trains travelling at 250 miles an hour, learning from the best experience of continental Europe and bringing that to Britain.
But how is it going to be possible to make that business case at a time, and I repeat the words again, the Chancellor says we're facing deeper and tougher cuts than during the 1980s?
Well, when I said earlier that we'll focus on the things that are a big priority for us, it's about making the savings in things that are of less significance and less importance, but also doing the sensible thing and making the long-term investment in things that are good for our country. So offshore wind, offshore wave, offshore the tidal power, those sorts of investments are of strategic importance to Scotland and the UK, and as is having long-term investment in a high-speed, speed railway system across the UK. So it's about doing what's right in the long term, as well as making those savings in the shorter term.
OK, let's move on to a couple of education questions, very disparate education questions. First one says, Jim, when you were a student, you marched in protest against the introduction of student loans. What made you change your mind and support them?
He's right. Whoever it was, he's right.
Stephen Martin from Dunfermline.
OK, well, I don't know if Stephen ever came on the demonstrations with
me. Sounds a bit like it.
What changed was that what I was campaigning about in those times was in a world where only 1 in 8 people went to university. We're now committed to half of the population getting a chance to go to college and university. And the truth is that the taxpayer cannot alone pay for that. I think if you want to go back to a world where only 1 in 8 and 1 in 10 went to university, you can have that argument that the rest should pay. Yes. But I think in a world where we want half of the people to go into further and higher education, I think it is sensible that government still pays most of the bill, but the students themselves contribute as well, and I think that's the big change.
Does that argument extend to tuition fees? Do you think they will have to be restored in Scotland in some form?
I think that way lies trouble for me as the Secretary of State. That's a decision for the Scottish Parliament, and I've made it my business over the time.
Isn't devolution handy on these occasions, Mr Murphy? Isn't devolution useless?
Devolution isn't just handy, it's also the right thing to do, and I don't think you need me as the House of Commons politician to second-guess what the Scottish Parliament will do. I think that we've got fantastic universities in Scotland that do brilliant research work, and we've got to ensure that they remain internationally competitive. How that happens is really for folks at the Scottish Parliament to decide. OK,
Robert Cooper from Paisley, a very different question. Faith-based schools. He says they're a needless expense to the taxpayer, divisive and belong in a bygone era. Do you think they should go, or do you think they should stay?
I couldn't disagree with that more. And it's almost as if the idea that it's faith-based schools are a waste to the taxpayer. And people of faith pay tax. And the question implies that people of faith don't pay tax. This isn't a way.
But they can have schools, but why should they have a faith-based
school? People who pay tax, who wish their children to go to faith-based education and the ethos that provides, it's important that that right's respected. And whether that's for Catholic schools, in my own area, I've got a faith-based, predominantly Jewish school. And it's a good thing that folk of that faith are able to send their children to a school where they feel comfortable and where that's important to them. You don't agree with Mr
Cooper's view that it's state-funded sectarianism?
Do you know, this is an idea that the state gets money from some dark cave somewhere. This is money coming from people, taxpayers, people who work, who have children, who wish their children to be educated in a way with a faith-based ethos. Now, it's not as if they're being indoctrinated. And they get education in all sorts of different faith diversity and ecumenical approach to faith. And the fact is they get brilliant education in the same way that they do in non-denominational schools. They get brilliant education with an additional part of faith. So I don't think it's a waste. And for as long as parents with faith wish their children to go to faith-based schools, the Labour government will support them.
Thanks for that. Well, more questions on the faith issue. Your own speech, of course, prompting some questions. One on health, though. One that straddles devolution and the budget. The Scottish Government proposing minimum pricing for alcohol in the budget. The Chancellor slapped an extra 10 pence above inflation on cider, deliberately, he said, trying to make that drink more costly. Linda Williamson from Torrance says that doesn't that mean that Labour looks a little bit hypocritical, opposing minimum pricing in Scotland and then using the duty power to slap on additional price on cider?
There was a particular problem with some cider. I wasn't actually aware of it. As you probably know, I don't drink, so I don't drink cider. I don't drink any alcohol, which perhaps makes me the worst person to answer this question in Scotland. But we got to a situation where some ciders that have no apples in them, but a huge alcohol content, so apple-free, high alcohol cider was really fueling an awful big problem in terms of antisocial behaviour and unruly behaviour, particularly amongst teenagers, the vast majority of whom are well behaved, but some were intoxicating themselves in this. So that's why we've done what we've done, to try and change that behaviour. But more generally, I think the idea that you have minimum pricing across the board is in general just a way of improving the profits of supermarkets, and I don't want anything to do with that. I think a better way of doing it is across the tax system, and that's the approach the Labour government takes.
The Scottish Government say that the 10p on cider puts about 20p on a bottle, whereas their proposals on minimum pricing, if it's at 40p a unit, it could put more than £3 on a bottle of cider. In other words, you're doing this much and they're proposing to do yay much.
That's not the case. I mean, they're making a pretty incoherent argument about a pretty weak case that they have. There's a particular problem about cider, which is why we've acted in the way we've done. The way the SNP Edinburgh government are behaving is they want to punish all drinkers. They want to punish the law-abiding majority who go about their business and who wish to enjoy a careful drink by charging more across the board. And I think all that does is increase the profits of those people who sell the alcohol, and it just doesn't work.
Let's turn to an issue that affects the Labour Party directly, the state of the party in Glasgow. Several questions, many questions. On that, Thomas Sterling from Paisley says, will the Labour powers that be carry out an investigation into corruption within City Hall in Glasgow?
Well, Thomas from Paisley is asking us about Glasgow. I don't live in Glasgow, and neither does he. So in terms of the specific point, without getting into the detail of any police investigation or audit report, I've told in the news today that they've come to a conclusion that they won't progress with any police inquiry or any Audit Scotland investigation. So in terms of inquiries, that's very clearly the case. I'm pretty proud of what Labour's achieving in Glasgow.
Really?
Yeah, Glasgow's a city that's made a lot of improvements.
A Labour leader having to resign after
the Labour Party is more than one individual. I think what happened to Stephen Purcell was a horrible situation for himself and his family. It was a personal trauma for him. But there are wider issues about Labour in Glasgow. I think that Glasgow, the same way as other parts of Scotland, that Glasgow is a city on the move. It's doing good things, the way in which the schools have been improved, big efforts in regeneration, support for businesses in Glasgow, a lot of people getting a chance to get into work through the Guaranteed Apprenticeship Scheme. There's still things that can be done, but Glasgow is a city that I think we can be proud of.
How about the accusation?
And regardless of one individual, what happened to Stephen was a terrible personal
individual. You don't think there's any case for an
tragedy.
investigation into, for example, the contracts awarded by the arms length organisations that he set up?
So those are an issue for Audit Scotland and the police, not the Labour Party. And as I understand it, the police and Audit Scotland have said very clearly that they don't wish to take that any further. But in terms of Glasgow more generally, I'm proud of having been born in the city of Glasgow. I think it's a phenomenal city. It's an international reputation. And I just wish people, the gentleman from Paisley and others, stop knocking Glasgow. We should be proud of Glasgow in the same way that we're proud of Edinburgh, the same way that we're proud of Dundee with the games industry, the same way we're proud of Aberdeen with the oil and gas industry. Stop knocking ourselves. It's one individual who got himself into an awful lot of trouble in the way in which he lived his life. Now, I don't happen to live my life that way. It's unfortunate and a personal tragedy for him that he chose to live his life in private in that way. But let's not besmirch a whole city because of the behaviour of one individual.
Let's broaden it. Vincent McGovern from Glasgow says, I'm quoting him, Labour peers suspended and disciplined, Labour MPs prosecuted, former cabinet ministers having the whip withdrawn, and Glasgow City Council leader vanishing in disgrace. How on earth can voters trust your party?
Well, I think that some of these individuals involved in this have got big questions to answer. I saw on television these secret recordings of these former three ministers, and the things that they said turned my stomach. I was embarrassed by it and I was angry by it. That's not the way for any politician of any political party to behave. So again, it's right that there's inquiries into these 3 or 4 individuals, and whichever party any of these people happen to be in.
It's individual, it's not indicative of an endemic problem within the Labour Party.
I don't think it is, and I think more importantly what I think is what the public senses on this. I think that what we've seen in the past few months is increased support for Labour in Scotland and across the rest of Great Britain. As the closer we get to the election, the greater sense of a two-horse race and a choice that the country faces. And the more that people see what Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling are doing in comparison to David Cameron and George Osborne, an awful lot of people who perhaps were scunnered with Labour in the past, who perhaps protested by voting SNP or Liberal Democrat over the Iraq War or all sorts of other issues, increasingly they're coming back to Labour, coming home to Labour, to support Labour in this close two-horse race election.
Don't you have a leadership problem at the very top, never mind at Glasgow City Council, with the Prime Minister? I mean, the Tories' biggest hit is to say, do you want another 5 years of Gordon Brown? If it becomes a referendum on Gordon Brown, you've had it, haven't you?
Elections are always about choices rather than referendums, and a choice between Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling versus David Cameron and George Osborne, I'm confident we can win. 6 months ago, this was a one-horse race. Everyone said it's done. It's in the bag. The Tories have won. Now, no one's so sure.
He's not the easiest marketing exercise.
I'm pretty clear this is neck and neck now, Labour versus Tory, and the more people look at David Cameron and George Osborne, they realise they're really just not up to it. Now, is Gordon an easy marketing exercise? Probably not. He doesn't smile comfortably, and Cameron is a kind of superficially a much more kind of carefree individual. But, you know, for Cameron it's superficial, it's public relations, and it isn't about electing some sort of X-factor celebrity person, superficial here today, gone tomorrow celebrity. It's about who do you want in charge of the 5th largest economy in the world. Who's got the experience, who's got the personality, who's got the politics and values. And I think Gordon Brown versus David Cameron is no contest. So do I want him to smile superficially? Do I want him to kid on that he's listening to Snow Patrol or the Arctic Monkeys in his iPod when he gets out of bed? No, I think he tried that. It didn't work. That was a mistake. He knows it was a mistake. Gordon will be what Gordon is, which is a phenomenal world leader who knows the economy of the United Kingdom and other countries better than any world leader, as he's proven as we come through this recession across the world. Thanks
for that. I promised the viewers questions on faith. Several questions in following your own speech on an invocation to people of faith to go with Labour. Now, Gary Winter from Strathmiglo. Gary, thanks for your question. He's not happy with that. He says, your invocation to people of faith to vote Labour, given the hostility of leaders of your own faith and the dismay of atheists like myself, which erupted when you raised the issue so clumsily earlier this year. He's not happy.
Well, Gary's got a right not to be happy. That's up to him. He's an atheist, and I understand his anger about all organised faith. My point was this, and it's a pretty straightforward one, is that there are people of faith in Scotland and there are people of faith across the United Kingdom, and that all political parties have to respect that when we compile our policies and our approach to life.
But you were going further. You were saying that they had a natural home in Labour.
Brian, I don't know if you read the speech.
I did. I read the whole thing.
I said very clearly that, quite rightly in this country, no party has corralled faith or faith voters.
You said that Labour support was strongest among religious people, and you needed to replicate that lead in the coming elections.
It happened at the last election. The Labour Party did very well amongst people of faith because of the work that we do in international development, the sense of responsibility across the world, and the sense that we have a responsibility to others.
You tried to equate religious values like fairness with Labour values. You did that quite well.
And then I said, unlike in continental Europe, where you have Christian socialist parties and all these other religiously aligned political parties, in mainland Britain, we don't have that, and it's a good thing that we don't have that. You have people of faith in all political parties. You have people without faith in all political parties.
Because you've got a fair doing from the various churches.
Well, that's fine. I don't mind. I don't mind that. I'm just putting my head above the parapet and saying that
the Catholic Church said it was all very well, but you're a systematic and unrelenting attack on family values.
Well, I don't agree with that, but I think it's fine for all others to criticise what I said personally. And it's my personal view, is that all politicians and political parties have to respect people of faith, and that faith isn't a thing of the past. There are hundreds of thousands of Scots for whom faith is very important, and there's a sense amongst some people in Scotland that, you know, we become more modern, and therefore faith has become less important. You can be modern, open, democratic, and have faith. That's my point.
Briefly on the subject of the Pope's visit, the papal visit, which you have been instrumental in indicating that there would be a substantial Scottish element, which there will indeed be. Again, loads of questions on this. Gerard Runham, hope I've got that right, from Afford, says, why is the visit by the Pope being funded by the taxpayer when he, the Pope, represents a small proportion of the population, interferes in British politics and discriminates against women and gays?
Well, Gerard, the point is that the costs will be met jointly in a fair apportionment between the government and the Catholic Church. Where there are Catholic events, the Church will meet those costs. But, for example, the Queen has invited the Pope. So Her Majesty has invited the Pope.
It's a state visit rather than purely a religious visit.
The first meeting between the Pope will have in the UK is with Her Majesty the Queen in Edinburgh. This is the first...
At Holyrood Palace?
Yes, that's right. It's the first official visit by a Pope in history. When the late Pope John Paul II came, it was a faith visit, it was an unofficial visit. This is the first time in our history we've had an official visit. And we'll treat the Pope in the same way that other countries treat the Pope. The Pope when he's in Portugal, when he's in the United States, and when he's other countries. Once he's invited, we treat him with dignity and respect. People have got the right to be against this visit.
Yes.
People have got a right to write letters, emails, and everything else and complain about it. But I think it's good manners that Her Majesty having invited him, the United Kingdom government also have invited him, that we pay some of the costs, but the Catholic Church will pay the price and the cost of those exclusively Catholic events. But that's the right thing to do. Just
briefly, do you think the visit is likely to be overshadowed by the controversy over events in America, that tragic case dreadful case involving Father Murphy, and the accusation that the Pope was instrumental in covering it up?
You know, I think people of all faiths and people of no faith, I just disgusted by the vile, high-profile cases of the abuse by priests and others of children and vulnerable adults. But that's for the Catholic Church to resolve and to come clean about and deal with, and they have to do that. But I don't think it will overshadow the papal visit, because the papal visit is about the celebration of all that is good in faith, all that's good in the Catholic Church and all churches. The Church of Scotland will be involved in this visit. People of all faiths will be involved in an ecumenical sense in this visit. So I think it's about not just that faith aspect, but also the relationship between the United Kingdom government and the Vatican, because of course the Vatican is a state in itself with enormous international reach on all sorts of issues, not least international development and world poverty. So I think it's a big event in September. Most Scots, I think, will give the Pope a warm welcome. Not an unquestioning welcome, but a pretty warm welcome, I think.
OK, let's turn. We're coming to the close of the broadcast, so let's turn to some questions that come more directly to yourself, Mr Murphy. The Scotland office, Ian Anderson in Edinburgh wants to know, the Scotland office is costing £10 million a year. Can you clarify what the role is and why it costs so much? A string of other questions asking the same thing. What is the job? What do you do? And why can't we just get rid of the Scotland office?
Well, we did get rid of the full-time Secretary of State for Scotland for a while, and it didn't work. It was a mistake. It gave the impression to Scotland that Scotland was less important around the Cabinet table than Wales and Northern Ireland when they had a full-time Secretary of State. It was wrong for Scotland, for example. It was wrong to the armed forces that those two jobs were shared with Des Brown. The role of the Scotland office is to speak up for Scotland when it comes to discussions around the Cabinet table, in the same way that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and Wales do the same thing for their parts of the United Kingdom. And my argument is pretty straightforward. Scotland is no less important than Wales and Northern Ireland, and it's my job to argue that it's more important. And I think that while we have the constitution that we do have, it's right that Scotland's treated in the same way that Northern Ireland and Wales is. So for as long as there's a Secretary of State job, I'll continue to do it to the best of my ability.
Stephen Beale in Kirkcaldy reckons that £10 million is mostly spent attacking the SNP, but doing nothing to stand up for Scotland.
Well, Brian, I suspect in this interview I've rarely, except when provoked to do so, I haven't done that. My job is to try and do what's best for Scotland. During this recession, as we come out of the recession, try and get the best deal for Scotland. So whether it's, for example, the firing ranges, the MOD firing ranges in the Western Isles, whether it's tax credits for the games industry in Dundee, whether it's this £2 billion Green Investment Bank, it's about making sure Scotland at least gets an equal share. For example, the Future Jobs Fund, 10,000 Scots are getting funded through the Future Jobs Fund. We've done a deal with every SPL football club just last week, for the first time ever, doing these sorts of deals, doing things differently. And again, that's only happening in Scotland. Now, I'm not going to take the credit for it. Perhaps I did something to make that happen, but that's only happening in Scotland. And it's happening in Scotland because the Scotland office, with the football clubs and the working pensions departments, saw the power of football, the remarkable inspiration of football, people going into football grounds and doing a day's work instead of being stuck on benefit. And those are some examples. But it's for others to judge at the election. But I'm confident that come the election, the people of Scotland still want to have representation in the UK government. Now, those people who don't believe in the UK will, of course, argue against the Secretary of State in the Scotland office. But the majority of Scots think we're a better country because we're part of the UK.
Sticking with football, a question from Mr. A. Black. He now lives in Glasgow, but he says he's a Dingwall expat. You can probably see where this one is coming from. He says he's treading upon your personal pain as a Celtic supporter.
How does he know I'm a Celtic supporter?
He says I think you are a Celtic supporter. Let's not muck about here. Let's start from the base. You're a Celtic supporter. He says Ross County are going to give Celtic a good thrashing in the Cup semi-final at Hampden. Celtic are a broken team. You can't stand up to the might of the Staggies. Apparently,
the Staggies,
Ross County are known as the Staggies. I didn't know that.
Well, the way Celtic played at Love Street the other night, I thought I could have got a game for them in central defence. Maybe Celtic should play Ross County with 9 men. It seemed to work for Rangers when they were playing St Mirren. But, do you know, I think there's my worry, what's happening...
Did nobody have to go?
So I don't hire and fire any football manager, but a lot of Celtic supporters wanted them to go. I think that was a pretty dreadful result. The important thing now is they stabilise things and get on to being successful. Because I think Scotland needs at least the old firm being successful, not just domestically but in Europe. And therefore,
as a Dundee United supporter, I would.
And then I was going to say, and Aberdeen, Dundee United, Hibernian, and Hearts. I mean,
stop before you name every team.
No, I won't name every team. But these are what you could do actually. Kilmarnock and all these. They have a phenomenal history.
Typical politician.
They have a great history of winning Scottish Cups and occasional brilliance in Europe. And I think we want to get back to those days. And my worry isn't just about Celtic or any one individual team. I think there's a danger of having a real feel-bad factor about Scottish football at the moment. The gap between Scotland and the Premiership has widened. We're disconnected from the major leagues across Europe. We're not able to compete in the Champions League in the way that we used to in Scotland. And I think our one hope at the moment is the Scottish national team. Now, of course, we're not going to South Africa, but I've got great hope that Levine can reignite the passion and the success of the national team. But we've got to have a long, hard look at Scottish football, because while there are brilliant youngsters, there is some phenomenal young talent in Scotland. For some reason, they just don't make it through to that top bracket and make a success of our club football.
Jim Murphy, thanks very much
Thank you
for joining us. And that's the end of the webcast from me, Brian Taylor. Toodaloo the new.